Hi everyone, we are back for the second day of the carbon pricing
Bonjour, est-ce que vous
conference,
m'entendez?
and with I'm Fabrice Tech
Oui, moi je vous
Venture,
entends.
and with
Bonjour,
my
c'est Charlotte.
co-chair, Dr.
Bonjour
Isabelle
Antoine.
Chenekowski-L'Oriol.
Ok,
We are
par
very
contre j'ai pas
pleased
de
to welcome
son.
you this morning
Vous entendez du
for a
son
very
sur les
amazing
autres
days
intervenants?
to tailor-made. What can carbon pricing do? What can the finance sector could embed this issue within its own roadmap, and what can the industries player,
Moi, Antoine, je vous
starting
entends parfaitement en
from
tout
the
cas.
energies one to
Et est-ce que vous entendez
their
d'autres
industrial
personnes?
consumer,
Non.
could
Ah pardon,
drive
c'était là
forces
votre question. Non,
toward a net
pardon.
Non,
zero target.
non, il n'y a pas de problème. Ok.
So
Bon,
let's
donc,
come for this first panel. I'm going to introduce probably during this moment our panelists for this morning. So I'm very pleased to welcome Antoine Vallier from the Caisse des dépôts and Consignation, which is a French institution finance player. And Antoine, he is expert on the biodiversity branch. And so welcome to you, Antoine, for this morning.
Yes, so Antoine Vallier, I actually work at CDC Biodiversité, so it's a subsidiary of Caisse des dépôts, who is dedicated to biodiversity conservation and biodiversity restoration. And it's been now 6 years that we're working on methodology for biodiversity footprinting, the global biodiversity score that we are now deploying among companies and investors. To provide a solution a bit equivalent to the carbon footprint, where you can, it's a tool where you can capture the footprint of an economic activity in one aggregated metric, taking into account the full value chain. But I'll probably have some time to talk to you about it a bit later on.
Okay, thanks, Antoine, for sharing this. Now probably back to Charlotte Garn, from the French Finance, Economies and Recovery Minister. Charlotte, could you introduce yourself to speak before running the panel on the green finance trends? Please, Charlotte.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. So my name is Charlotte, and I work at the French Treasury, and I'm in charge of sustainable finance and climate risk. So I'm in charge basically of negotiating on behalf of the French government, EU, and French regulations on sustainable finance, and leading project management on fossil fuel divestment. And can you hear me?
Okay. Thanks, Charlotte. I think that we are going to set up some. Yes, the sound sometimes it's not with the feedback. Anyway, we are going to run this panel, and just before introducing our two other panelists, because I know that Antoine by your side and Charlotte, you're going to have a meeting just in a few minutes, just running this one and drive forces on the green finance trends that you can highlight for this morning. So I will start with you, Charlotte. Let's start like this. From your point of view, there is diversity of green finance trends. We used to speak about the raising phenomenon on the green bonds decades ago, and countries' institutions are very implicate themselves to fund a sustainable infrastructure by emitting green bonds. Now, social bonds is another green finance trend, who is raising a lot. The biodiversity asset, the natural capital asset, is another piece of the how can we say, not the trends, but probably according to the COP 15 on Kunming in next month, we are going to have a raise up of the consciousness for financial players on the biodiversity footprint and impact. What are for you the position, the new position of the financial sector, and surely by an institution player? What is the role of the finance today for you?
Thank you for the question, Fabrice. And actually, with regard to green bonds, I think the financial market, the market on green bonds, is progressively being more and more structured, and that is thanks to shared shared language more and more on what means to be green, and also a breadth of academic research on greenium and the cost of second-party opinions. I think that the more we go, the more that we see that green bonds are a crucial instrument to actually finance the green, the energy and the ecological transition, and also the green recovery. The European Union has showed that green bonds were primarily important instrument in financing the post-COVID Next Generation EU fund of 750 billion euros. And so I think that what we are going to see in terms of trends for the future months and years is, first of all, progressive standardization of green bonds via the EU taxonomy, for instance, in the European Union, and actually more beyond the European Union, shared principles on taxonomies worldwide, which will ensure that investors actually share not only the same language in terms of what means the energy transition, but also share that carbon neutrality objective embedded into criteria for projects to be actually financed via green bonds. I think that's the first element. The second one is that the more we are standardizing extra financial information coming in from issuers, the more the cost of second-party opinions, for instance, and more broadly, the cost of the issuance are going to go down a little bit, which is going to spur the market probably even more. There's always a risk, of course, of an asset bubble. We think that, at least in the EU, the more we have a broad taxonomy which encompasses a whole economy approach with criteria to define carbon neutrality in all sectors of the economy, and not just solely concentrating on low carbon technologies that are already available, but also concentrating on decarbonizing how to abate industrial processes in all sectors of the economy. This is going to enlarge the market and enlarge the potential for proceeds to actually finance projects that aim for carbon neutrality for many sectors of the economy. And I think that a third trend that we've seen so far, and a lot of academic research, for instance, has showed that, is that it's not so much about the greenium, for instance, in the green bond market. It's also about who is actually holding green bonds and investing in green bonds. And the more, more and more we're seeing that institutional investors and long-term investors are actually primary holders of green bonds, and they do adopt that buy and hold strategy, which ensures that proceeds are actually coming in quite long-term projects, I would say, at least. And so that is spurring the market as well. And maybe a fourth trend, and I'll stop here because I know we have a lot to talk about this morning, but I would say that the fourth trend is that beyond solely green bonds, of course, we've seen a spur in social bonds because of the COVID-19 crisis, but there is also a spur in what we call sustainability-linked bonds. And beyond sustainability-linked bonds, we see a spur in sustainability-linked instruments. And the way, for instance, we're thinking the EU taxonomy in the EU is also not only setting the objective to be met in terms of carbon neutrality by each economic activity, by each sector of the economy, but also setting trajectories and sectoral trajectories for decarbonization, which would ensure that the more intermediary thresholds that we have, the more we can plug such taxonomy to sustainability-linked instruments and sustainability-linked bonds in particular, because the investors would be able to, let's say, very simply to check to what extent a particular business is actually decarbonizing on the right trend, on the right pathway, and following a carbon neutrality pathway. And so I think that green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds are going to be complementary instruments to actually finance a transition that is both ambitious. That's the case of green bonds because it does finance projects that are already green, one might say, but also sustainability-linked instruments, which are very good instruments also to finance the economy, which is still carbon intensive today. So yeah, I think these are going to be the main trends, at least for the months and years to come. And the position of the market and the regulator himself also has strongly evolved because of these trends.
For also starting to set the scene on this green finance trend. I will be back to you in a few minutes. According to another question. Now, I would like to go back to Antoine Vallier, who is from Caisse des Dépôts and Consignation on the biodiversity branch. Yes, Antoine, when you hear Charlotte on this aspect, all those aspects, what could be your point of view according to the environment footprint and the understanding by financial institution players, and also for the private sector, what could be, in fact, for you, the other piece of the finance trends according to the biodiversity footprint? Yes, please, Antoine.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I would say that on biodiversity, we're starting to see the same trends, and the way the market is structuring is following the climate. So we're probably not as matured on this thematic than we are matured on the carbon. The first reason for that is that at the moment the information is much less available for investors to actually really take decisions taking into account biodiversity. So that's the thing we're really working on, is to provide this information at the issuer level, at the portfolio level. And it's a challenge that we've been working on for the past 5-6 years, but we're now really seeing an acceleration from companies and from investors to actually starting to use that information, to use the footprint tools, because there's a need both in terms of risks and opportunities. I mean, it's clearly stated now that biodiversity is a risk, the same way that climate change is a risk. So investors are starting to understand that they have to understand this risk, and a good way to approach this risk is by starting to assess their impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. That's the first players probably who structured this approach are the central banks. The central banks of Netherlands conducted an analysis on the exposure of the biodiversity risk of their financial sector. There are similar works going on in France and in other countries. More recently, in France, we just had a new decree, Article 29, and maybe Charlotte will be able to talk a bit in more details about it. But what's very interesting here is that there's a clear statement as well about the risk, about the fact that investors have to report on risks, that they have to make also a clear distinction from the transition risk coming from the impacts, and the physical risk more coming from the dependencies. So really, like there's a momentum here in terms of reporting and understanding what are the different links of their investment with biodiversity. There's also definitely an opportunity side. We seeing now that we provide solutions for investors, more and more players from the asset management side that would love to be able to provide products dedicated to biodiversity, so something a bit more thematic than just ESG fund, but something more specialized on biodiversity. We're starting to see those funds appearing with different criteria, because there's a trend where like people would like to either invest directly in biodiversity, but I would say at this stage it's maybe a bit more difficult, but at least to have something, some products which are biodiversity friendly and which are mostly avoiding major impacts on biodiversity. So yes, so I would say like the risk and opportunities, both sides are growing, and the momentum is fattening, especially with the international agenda, where definitely the COP15 at the end of the year will give a lot of visibility on biodiversity, and a lot of investors want to be able to be there and to show that they understand this problematic, and that they will be an active player on it.
Indeed, a long-term strategy, if you have to preserve it. When it comes with green bonds to finance sustainable infrastructure, it's also about long-term view. From your point of view, the institutional player, as you are both, and the private sector, how can converge together in a public and private partnership to co-finance both asset infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, and also the biodiversity to preserve? How can we manage a good equilibrium between institution financial player and the private financial player for a convergence of long-term view?
I can jump in first if you want.
Yes, sure, Charlotte.
I think it's an interesting question, because I think that all what we are doing in terms of what we call sustainable finance cannot actually replace an ambitious environmental policy. Actually, so I'm speaking more from, as far as the EU is concerned, because that's obviously what I know the best, but I would say that when the European Commission published right before the COVID crisis, it was in December 2019, the Green Deal, I was myself, even personally, very happy, because I thought for once there is a clear roadmap in terms of how to combine environmental policy and industrial policy in the European Union, not only by revising a lot of existing regulations, of sectoral existing regulations, for instance, with regard to water management, with regard to the steel industry, with regard to hydropower, with regard to forest management, with regard to lots of sectoral aspects with agriculture and all that. Of course, as long as we don't have, in terms of, at least as far as the climate first is concerned, then I'll talk about biodiversity, but as long as we don't have a price on carbon, which actually reflects fully the externalities that the rise in greenhouse gas emissions is putting on humanity, of course, and on all sectors of the economy, I think that what we are doing in terms of sustainable finance will still be efficient, but probably not as economically efficient as we might hope if carbon pricing was actually really on the rise. But that said, actually, as far as sustainable finance itself is concerned, I think the way that institutional players such as regulators, supervisors, coalitions also of central banks, I'm thinking about the Network for Greening Financial System, but lots of existing coalitions of public actors, how they may participate with the private sector into financing sustainable infrastructure. I think that first of all, it comes of having a clear roadmap of what actually means to reach carbon neutrality in a particular area. That could be in a country, in a given country, in France, for instance, in the European Union, but also worldwide. I think that the way that countries are giving their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement is actually not fully backed up by a real business plan of what that transition entails. And I think that the way that the financial sector can have that clear view on what is actually to finance would be with that clear roadmap. And so the way that it's been done for now is via the EU taxonomy for sustainable economic activities, because once again, it does cover all sectors of the economy, not right now, but it will tomorrow, because it's being progressively built. And it gives you, if not the trajectories for now, it gives you the objectives to be met. And if not, if the objective is not the carbon neutrality objective for now, because the criteria would be reinforced over time, at least it allows one economic activity to get much, much more closer to that carbon neutrality objective. And so the way that the EU has seen that in terms of partnership between the public sector and the private sector into financing such infrastructure is by setting up this taxonomy and embedding the taxonomy into every single regulation you can think of, including embedding the taxonomy, for instance, in the European Investment Bank's climate plan and financing plan. So I think that's one of the tools we have right now. Of course, it doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's the only tool that the public sector can actually put forward to dialogue with the private sector. But I think that it's one of the elements of a clear roadmap. And that roadmap today is still lacking. I mean, of course, we have the IEA, for instance, which published this very ambitious, and that's a great thing, actually, scenario to reach net zero by 2050. But that gives you a worldwide roadmap of what should be done. But then it should be, there should be a breakdown of that scenario at the regional level, for instance, taking into consideration, of course, the fact that we live in a globalized world. And so we cannot think only at the regional level, of course. As far as biodiversity is concerned, but Antoine will know much better that than I do, but I think that it also comes, for instance, if we think about the taxonomy, it will be developed on the biodiversity objective. Actually, there are two biodiversity objectives in the EU taxonomy. One that relates to the preservation and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, and one which relates to the preservation and sustainable use of marine resources. I think that this is a very important step forward for the European Union, and these criteria for all economic activities, as long as they can contribute substantially to biodiversity preservation, will be developed by the end of this year or by early 2022. And I think that, I mean, it's a call I'm launching here, but I think it's something very important to look at and to intervene in the European process to develop such criteria. Of course, it's only one tool. I'm not saying it's you know, everything revolves around that taxonomy, but it's one of the most important tools, at least, that the EU has put forward to dialogue with the private sector and to make sure that we share that clear roadmap. I'll stop here because I think that Antoine probably has much to say on biodiversity, but I can totally react, sure, of course, afterwards.
Sure. Yes, thanks, Charlotte, for also going deeper in this field. In fact, the scheme, a common scheme to build dialogue in the public and private sector, both for the long-term view, is today the green taxonomy. We wouldn't speak about today, but it will be another session dedicated one to a convergence of the taxonomy, financial taxonomy, from the different places in the world, from the European one, the American one, the Asia one, in particular the China one. And probably let's back on this asset. You mentioned the carbon pricing, which is not only the title of the conference, but I would like to go with Antoine with this. According to the biodiversity footprint, do you think that now it's the time of convergence on this issue, that not only to make a footprint on the biodiversity, but try to find a price on the biodiversity? Yes, Antoine, what is your point of view?
It is a very interesting question, and there are advantages to have theoretically, at least, a price on biodiversity, the same way we would have a price on carbon. If we somehow would agree on, say, okay, 1 square meter of virgin forest is worth that much, and we try to put a price on it, or a market price on it, to actually create the same kind of dynamics than with the carbon. It might be interesting, but I think we're quite far from there at the moment, because it's a very difficult exercise, actually, putting a price on biodiversity. I mean, it really depends what kind of approach you will have. If it's, but just identifying a budget of which is the first step in carbon pricing, is we identified a global budget for carbon. So I would say that we have first to decide what is the global budget we have on biodiversity. So there's a lot of work to do, and scientific work do to actually really define what is quantitatively the planetary boundary. From there, what is our goal and how we would measure it, or at least express it in numbers. And then I come back to what Charlotte was saying. There's a great role for public institutions to explain and actually put a framework which is regional specific, which is sectoral specific, with trajectories where we can reach those goals. And maybe one of the tools to align to those trajectories would be at one point some kind of biodiversity pricing. But I think we have other steps first to validate on biodiversity, and it's probably a bit early for that topic to start with.
We are quite in time for what we have to drive for this morning. I know that you have both a meeting just in a few minutes, so probably it will be the title of another conference, not only on the trends, but the pricing of the biodiversity, or the convergence of the climate on whatever the carbon issues and the biodiversity. For us, it's quite the same topic, because when we talk about natural carbon sink, surely that biodiversity is one of the most powerful one today. So I would like to thank you very much, Antoine Vallier from Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations on the biodiversity branch, and Charlotte Garde from the Minister of Finance and Economy. Let you back to your daily job, to the next call, and pleased to have you this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion, and have a good conference. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. See you next.
Bye-bye.
And now we are going to be back on another session, another message from René Carsanti. René Carsanti is a former chairman of ICMA, the International Capital Market Association. He is also former director on the World Bank, and he's going to share with us a message. So, yes, please.
Thank you very much, Fabrice, and many thanks to the conference chairman, Professor Jouzel, and the organizers for your invitation. Well, the urgency to succeed in financing the energy transition and reorienting the private capital to more sustainable investments require a comprehensive shift in how the financial system works. And the role of major market participants and investors is essential. Many already integrate ESG criteria in their investment decision. This is necessary if we were to develop more sustainable economic growth, ensure the stability of the financial system, and foster more transparency and long-termism in the economy. But beyond its quasi-moral obligation, mobilization for energy transition financing is also, I believe, an historic opportunity to position regions such as the European Union markets as pioneers and world leaders. Let's look at the incredible progress and contribution of this green and sustainable finance over the years, an exponential growth. In 2006, green and social bonds were non-existent. The European Investment Bank, the World Bank, the vaccine bonds of IFIM, ICMA, the International Capital Market Association, have been important pioneers. And I personally, you mentioned it, thank you, was greatly privileged to work in all those institutions and to be part of several significant green and social bond initiatives. Just to give you a background, just 10 years ago, green issuance volume was still a minuscule share of the bond market. In 2014, when the ICMA green bond principles, the standards, the market standards were introduced, only $5 billion were issued. Today, the cumulative value of outstanding green bonds in the market is over $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion. Today, at the same time, what we observe, the colossal damage from the COVID pandemic is becoming apparent. It has an estimated cost to the global economy of over $12 trillion. It has pushed hundreds of millions of additional people into poverty. And the pandemic has disrupted progress towards achieving the SDGs. But one aspect is already clear. It is the important role played by capital markets in intermediating capital to rebuild shattered economies. And indeed, the pandemic has served as an accelerant for growth in the global green, social, and sustainable bond markets. Just to give you a figure, a latest figure, in the first quarter of this year, sustainable bond issuance has accounted for more than $170 billion, nearly a 150% increase over the same period in 2020. In particular, I should stress the pandemic has been the catalyst for the spectacular growth in the social bond markets in financing the response to it. In 2020, $150 billion were issued, 8 times the previous year's issuance in social bonds, and the momentum, as we know, it continued to be very strong. Social bonds have emerged as a key instrument in financing a post-pandemic sustainable recovery. Again, with the EU in the lead, which is a remarkable development since the creation with the first IFIM vaccine bond of the social bond market in 2006. And although many were concerned during this pandemic that the focus on social bonds will detract from progress in the green bond market, in fact, it has been just the opposite, as green and environmental considerations have been hardwired into the country's program, both on the funding and disbursement side. There are some powerful undercurrents propelling these developments in the sustainable, green and sustainable market, including the new political response and the prospects which we observe in the US. But clearly, more is needed from all stakeholders to develop this market. And I will cite 5 key priorities. First, by broadening the market through innovation, diversification of market participants and products in the green and sustainability space. This is a very important development, and we should work in that respect. The last few months have also proved to be a period of remarkable innovation in that particular field. I will mention, in particular, the launch of the ICMA sustainability-linked bonds principle last June, a year ago, which has been followed by the launch of climate transition finance guidelines and handbook last December. Second priority, in my view, is the need to develop even more standards and taxonomies as harmonized globally as possible, in close consultation with market players. We should avoid fragmentation in that particular standardization. Third, there is a need to enhance disclosure in reporting by issuers and the investors, including on their climate transition strategy to generate even more confidence and robustness. As to measures of risk, I personally believe that we should greatly benefit from an additional new set of international impact weighted accounting standards, similar to the introduction of the international accounting standards after the 29 Great Depression. Some new accounting standards which will take into account and which will be a standardized tool to measure the net impact that companies have on the environment and the people. Fourth, I will mention fintech and digitalization of our financial markets. Looking to the future, this other main theme now driving the shape of the capital market alongside sustainable finance is indeed the fintech digitalization agenda. And this cuts across the entire value chain of bond markets, and obviously is a key consideration for ICMA and its members. And actually, a striking commonality between fintech and sustainability is a need for common standards and harmonization. And I believe fintech could be most useful to develop common platforms, particularly in the sustainable finance sector, for oversight, for facilitating comparability, and provide dynamic insight into ESG performance as well as ESG reporting. And finally, if you allow me, I would like to mention biodiversity. Addressing biodiversity and nature risks is attracting increasing interest as an investment theme. This is being pushed by investors through the UN PRI, for example, as well as individual initiatives such as Act for Nature from Amundi and other investors. It is also one of the 6 environmental objectives under the EU taxonomy, green taxonomy, which is central to the EU's biodiversity strategy 2030. In the UK, we see a global review of the economics of biodiversity, which was recently released in the form of a review commissioned to Cambridge professor Dasgupta in 2019 by the Treasury. And this will, I'm sure, will lead to important initiatives, including during the COP26 in the UK. I believe it is important to distinguish nature risks from climate change risk and to properly measure these different categories. For example, the gross domestic product does not include the depreciation of nature and declines in biodiversity. And yet, the World Economic Forum has estimated that around half of global GDP in 2019 was dependent on natural capital. Ultimately, all economic activities both depend on and influence the condition of ecosystems. And actually, depreciation and loss of natural capital has for many years been a main source of economic growth, but is nowhere taken into account in the calculations. So I believe we need to capture the true values or accounting price of natural capital to measure the financial risk and avoid further rapid destruction of our common biodiversity. As for transition in climate, these measures for nature are critical for market participants in their investment decisions. Banks and investors may be adversely affected by such nature risk. For example, by holding sovereign bonds of countries highly dependent on overexploitation of natural resources. Again, this risk is still underpriced by the market, and I believe needs to be clearly addressed and reported. To conclude, in 2015, Mark Carney, the then governor of the Bank of England, warned us about the tragedy of the horizons, or how finance has had to reconcile short-term issues and those over the longer period. Progress in green and sustainable finance has been most impressive since then. And the pandemic, as I said, has proven the importance of green and social finance and its positive development. Indeed, I believe the decade ahead of us promises to be exciting with new tools, participants, new practices and standards as we climate transition. More than ever, I believe that green and sustainable finance remains the future of finance, when finance is mindful of its environmental and social impacts, when finance invests in the future and protects its ecosystem, when finance saves lives. All of us should feel privileged to contribute responsibly to such a vital mission and to the opportunity to make a real and lasting impact. Thank you very much.
Thanks, René Carsanti, for setting the scene again on the green finance trends according to your old track records before launching this special, I think, session today. I will also now share with you a message of Kim Schumacher, who is an expert of sustainability finance, sustainable finance. Kim is based in Tokyo, and he's from the Tokyo Center of Technologies and also a lecturer on Oxford University. Yes, please have his message.
Dear participants of this year's Carbon Pricing Conference, greetings from Japan. It's already late here, and but it's a pleasure for me to participate in this year's conference and also to present some of the most recent trends in terms of ESG and green finance, and especially in terms of portfolio carbon decarbonization. So I'm a lecturer in sustainable finance and ESG at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and I'm also an adjunct lecturer at the United Nations University, and the University of Luxembourg, both in sustainable finance. And prior to that, I was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Oxford, again in ESG and sustainable finance. And today I will first talk to you about, in terms of portfolio decarbonization, one of the most recent trends has been the announcements, or the massive shift towards net zero emissions. So we have seen all different types of stakeholders, be it from asset owners to asset managers to different corporations. So everyone has been now announcing net zero targets. So what does that actually mean? That means that most of them announced by 2050, that in 2050 they basically want to have zero emissions. So basically that any emissions that they emit either will be offset or that they do not emit any emissions anymore, for example, by sourcing all of their energy needs from renewable sources. And that is only in theory. However, as good as it sounds that people or corporations, especially investors, they want to achieve net zero, there's a lot of questions that remain open about how that is supposed to be achieved. Because despite that being in line with what the Paris Agreement has said, so that we can still limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, there are significant inconsistencies between the messaging and between the actual action that is being taken. So, for example, the Climate Action 100, which basically monitors 100 more than 100 of the most polluting companies in terms of carbon emissions in the world, and they found that most of them announced a net zero target, so they want to become carbon neutral by 2050. However, only 6% basically showed any significant or showed capital expenditures that would be aligned with achieving that goal. So there's still a large misalignment between the what we call ex ante. So basically the signaling or the messaging before any tangible action has been taken. So these are merely just announcements. BlackRock is a good example, where Larry Fink recently issued one of his most recent letter to shareholders, where he said climate. I think he mentioned climate more than 15 times. So where he said that decarbonization of portfolios is the biggest challenge, but also their biggest ambition. But then there's other reports that state that BlackRock's actions do not align with what they try to achieve and with their ambitions that they communicate very openly. But then, for example, in terms of voting and taking influence on companies where they are invested in, where they have shares, where they own shares, they often vote against any decisive climate resolutions that are presented. So that is these discrepancies, these really misalignments, or these divergences. They are sort of like the cause why there is still we should still apply a lot of skepticism. Of course, we should be optimistic, but the key word that comes to mind in terms of a lot of these announcements these days is greenwashing. So a lot of is announced that creates a very positive image of a lot of companies when they announce a net zero target, or when they say they want to become carbon neutral in the near future. But then when you look at the fundamentals in terms of, for example, as I mentioned, capital expenditure, operational expenditures, then that does not hold up. So unless that gap is bridged in a meaningful way, I do not expect these pledges or these announcements or all these initiatives around net zero targets or around net zero portfolios that can actually be achieved within the time frame that many investors have set for themselves. Because the longer we wait to take decisive action, actually decarbonize our decarbonize portfolios in a meaningful way, the harder it will become to achieve that at a later stage, because then we need to even act in a more fundamental, in a more radical way. Then we need more radical decarbonization. And if we look at, for example, supply chain level emissions among corporations, what we usually call Scope 3 emissions. So we usually measure carbon emissions according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which divides it into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 1 emissions being the direct emissions that are generated through a company's activities. Then the Scope 2 emissions, which are the emissions created by electricity and energy purchases. And then Scope 3 emissions, basically the rest, so supply chain level emissions. And especially for, in case of a lot of companies, Scope 3 emissions, which often would constitute a significant portion of the emissions, are not adequately measured, not adequately reported. So with these issues in mind, this recent trend around net zero targets and carbon neutral portfolio decarbonization is still very much only theoretical in nature, and the resources that are directed towards achieving net zero remain largely inadequate. So that is important to bear in mind. So with this risk of large-scale greenwashing, what does it actually mean in terms of the actual carbon footprint of current portfolios? It means that a lot of portfolios, even though they sometimes have the name climate or sustainability or ESG in their titles, so they're also marketed that way, they're also promoted that way, they often have still significant carbon intensive activities, or still companies with very carbon intensive activities in the portfolio. So that also means that we also, as a society as a whole, are not doing enough to basically reduce our carbon emissions in a way that is in line with what the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015, is requiring for us to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And a good example, and being based in Japan is a good example, because although the government very recently, similar to many other governments, announced that they want to want to reach net zero as part of the economy as a whole, that seems a very elusive target at this stage, because they have not necessarily formulated any concrete strategies of how they want to get there. And even if you formulate a strategy, the implementation of said strategy is still a different thing. And the United States also under President Biden has been more climate action. However, they recently, President Biden also said something very interesting, which I think illustrates a little bit the dilemma, because he said that 50% of the carbon reductions that the United States wants to achieve basically come from inventions that have not been, or come from solutions that have not been invented yet. So he basically is counting on technological innovation as sort of a solution that will hopefully bring the necessary decarbonizations that we need to bring emissions down to a level that is in line with the Paris Agreement. But the problem of that, of course, is that these these technologies have not been invented yet. And that shows the entire dilemma, because the current action is largely inadequate, because even though there was a down, or a drop in global carbon emissions due to the COVID pandemic and the reduced economic activity resulting from that, emissions have almost risen again to pre-pandemic levels. So it shows that we are currently on a trajectory, on a pathway that leads us to definitely more than 2, and some scenarios say more than 3 degree global warming, which again, with all the negative consequences that are expected to materialize because of that. So in Japan, there's also the particular issue, it shows how hard it can be to basically transition to low carbon or even net zero portfolios in the future, because for example, in Japan, you have the government pension investment fund, the largest institutional investor in the world, and in the past they were very active in terms of ESG, but in more recent months they sort of slowed down on ESG integration because they concluded that ESG is not generating the returns that they expected. And it shows sort of like, yeah, the dilemma, because on the one hand, everyone is talking about ESG and everyone is talking about decarbonization and net zero. But on the other hand, we do not necessarily want to transition in such a significant way that it actually brings about meaningful change in terms of ESG performance. And unless we want to do that, we will likely not see a sufficient decarbonization across investment portfolios in the short to medium term that will sufficiently reduce carbon emissions in a way that can actually reduce also global carbon emissions in a meaningful way. So if we need to start as a solution, we need to start reimagining what outperformance actually is. Is it merely just financial outperformance? Or do we also go into more of the non-financial, the extra financial performance? So example, improved air quality. And because those are the metrics that probably will most easily be able to measure in the short term. And then once these metrics improve, it is likely that we will also see improved financial outperformance. But in a lot of cases, currently, a lot of portfolios, they integrate ESG in a very superficial manner. So we need a much more deeper integration of ESG, and we need much more, profound decarbonization across all portfolios, across all asset classes. So unless that happens, unfortunately, a lot of the net zero target announcements or pledges or initiatives, alliances, that almost every week there's a new announcement from a new company announcing a net zero target. What they are mostly is unsubstantiated greenwashing, because currently the resources do not match the announcements. With that, I wanted to provide my view on where I see the current state of ESG and especially decarbonization of investment portfolios. From Japan, I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope for those who want to reach out, please do so on LinkedIn. My name is Kim Schumacher. I'm a lecturer in sustainable finance at ESG at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and I'm looking forward to engage further with the participants and also with everyone who's interested in talking about ESG and sustainable finance. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Here on this session, Green Finance Trend, and we have just welcomed Kim Schumacher from his message on the perspective and the new, how can we say, the new asset when we have to drive ESG and how to avoid ESG, as we can call it, ESG washing or greenwashing. So thanks again, Kim Schumacher, for sharing this